My name is Tom Vack. I am a photographer of design. I've been here in Europe for 30 years. I came at the request of Michele De Lucchi, and subsequently worked with Philippe Starck, Ingo Maurer, Ron Arid, Mark Newson, and other especially important people in design. I'm here today to talk about what I've done in my life, my working life, I should say. Well, when I was quite young, I was asked to make a comment about photography, and I said, photography is meant to be seen and not heard, and like bad little children, more or less. Now that I've grown older and haven't talked for 30 years, you probably won't be able to stop me. So, where do I begin? I could start about my childhood. I was raised a third-generation Greek-American. My mother was born in the United States, but when she went to school, she couldn't speak any English because they just spoke no English in the house. And so that trauma made her really want us to be Americans. And so I was raised to be an American, not really acknowledging my Greek roots, except for certain holidays, I should say, and the need to go to church on Sunday. For me, being an American and growing up, as I look back on those years, I had a very strong sense and a desire for modernity. I felt bad in old situations, and I really viewed Europe as a kind of an old and dark place, and America as a kind of a beacon of newness and ingenuity and new ideas. That ironically didn't remain with me in my life, but the modernity sense is still with me, and that has been more or less my search to find a photographic language to accompany objects of modernity. How would I begin to say how I arrived here? I did a catalog in Chicago, where I'm from, for a store of design in 1984. It was called City. And in that catalog were pieces of a new French designer, Philippe Starck, the current trend and figure of modern, I'm losing the words there, so we can forget about that sentence. Among the other clients that they had was Memphis. And Memphis, from there, they had a show, and I met Michele De Lucchi, and he invited me to come to Italy to do some projects from him. And I'm coming to Italy and starting to work there. I found such a different culture of work that in the subsequent years I really couldn't return comfortably back into this work world of American professionalism. And the difference really being is that here in Europe, an artisan is held in quite high respect, where in America, an artisan is put into a Rolodex. And so this was, for my own vanity and pride, I found a home. And that home has subsequently developed me into the person that I would have thought myself to be when I was a university student. Basically, a Renaissance man. This was my goal in the university. I began in architecture. Shortly after that experience, which was a strong Bauhaus tradition school at the University of Illinois, I found that architecture was too long-term for its aesthetic rewards, its payback time. From there, I thought of graphics. I studied some art history, poetry, mathematics, philosophy, logic, and thought to develop my own idea of a autodidactic Renaissance man. Well, we were talking about films and their effect on a vision of modernity. They were always a kind of a chance, like concept cars of the 50s, of what the cars were going to be for the future. So this future thinking, being that I always wanted this modernity, was always churning in the background. And the other thing than wanting to be a painter was I wanted to be a filmmaker. So my idea was that, well, I would begin films one frame at a time by making still photos, because I was a one-man, and have been a one-man band. I've painted the backgrounds, I've built the sets, I've worked through the lighting, I traveled in my car with the backgrounds, and there was this kind of need to find a way to express this want of cinematography that brought me to this feeling of making images, making sets, making scenographies. And that brought me then to light, because light was the easiest and most economical way to convert a space, a plain white space, into an atmosphere. You could create a sense of space or place purely by light, and quite economically. And of course, this is pre-Photoshop. So everything had to be done in the camera. It required a sense of the process. And it was also in those days a sense that the photographer was the Wizard of Oz. We came in and did a kind of a magic that not everybody could do. They didn't have iPhones, they didn't have digital cameras, they didn't know what would come out of that box when they pushed the button until they got the films back from the grocery store or the pharmacy or wherever they took it. And so manipulating this process was the way that I was trained to think from my architectural background. And relating to the different aesthetics and different cultures and societies came from my interest in art history. And that brought me to the time of looking for, I wouldn't say it was my way, but it was for fitting into the times. I wanted to be part of the times. I wanted what I imagined to be something that was a defining vocabulary of the cultures that I was in. In the 80s, with Blade Runner, came a new vision, as well as Brazil, came new visions of future. And at the same time, we had movements in graphics, in music, in fashion, in a way that it was a new research into what could the old definitions be. And that's what was happening in Europe in design. And so I was very lucky, because I never approached anybody to ask them to work for them. It came by a kind of a destiny. We crossed paths, and from there we felt an affinity, and we did something together. I should say that I generally stayed with a few people over the years. Not like a social butterfly. I'm more of a hermit to be searched out and found. And so I was very lucky to find a few people that were willing to put themselves out, because the kind of photography that I did wasn't the most economically efficient. It required sacrifices from me to put my time, and very often my body and my sweat, and for them to invest more money than to get an image that you would say, oh, I see what that is, but you wouldn't feel what it was. Oh, I wanted you to feel it, or I wanted you to feel some mystery or something that was more than just, I don't like that term industrial design, because somehow, even if it's industrially made, it's not thought of in that way. It's not a way that we're making objects of industry. These became, particularly in the 80s, researches into what is a home, what is a toaster, what is a chair? Does it have 4 legs? Can you get by with 3? Unfortunately, comfort wasn't always the main point in these things, but that was irrelevant. We were so visually oriented that was enough in itself. And so the pictures, and I have to say that sometimes I was excessive, but they were also an opportunity to explore and to understand, and then later to refresh your palette and find a new way. And that's been how I've approached the work, still to these days. The wonderful thing that digital has brought are new opportunities and new ways to manipulate a process. But what it's taken away is the Wizard of Oz. Now it's the Wizard of Photoshop. You don't imagine being taken to a magic land. You say, oh yeah, Photoshop. So anything visually can happen. That's a bit of a loss, but it's also an opening for new ways of expression. And I'm sure that we're just at the very tip of those expressions, and that the new generations to come are going to take that to another level. It will probably be, though, 3D rendering and not photography. And some irony where photography replaced illustration in the last century. Now probably new illustration will replace photography, at least through the lens photography. So perhaps you've been wondering what these backgrounds have been in these discussions. We are here in the showroom of Ingo Maurer. And Ingo has been my client since 1987. And he is perhaps not only inspiration and a guide about light, but also about dreaming and remembered experiences, aesthetic experiences. But Ingo has a very strong sense of reference to art that's been filtered through his dreams and his emotions. And he allowed me, probably more than any other client, to indulge and experiment and look into the idea of dreams and space, and not to portray an object in a decor or a design place, but to create a modesty around an object that is also a way that he likes to live and to see his work. Ingo is also known as the poet of light. And so it was quite a challenge to accompany him, and his respect and his openness to give you a chance, even if in the end he completely disagrees with where you go. But he is probably the most supportive and amazing man to be co-involved with. When I came to him in the 80s, he was more involved in production, and he could take 3 years to decide about the length of a stick on a lamp. Every detail, every point, as minimal as it might seem to you, is considered with a microscope. And even the pictures, down to the very corners of them. We've had a long kind of relationship that's often been one that tries to put together two mindsets. My Mediterranean drama and his Germanic coolness and social democratic point of view. And perhaps that's what we're really talking about modesty. It's not to see design as an elitism, but to see it more as a every man's object. And that's where we're all united in our dreams. We all dream. We don't all remember them. But this is something about Ingo that has been one of my good fortunes to go down this path that continues to this day. And at 82 years old, Ingo is still amazingly fertile and manages more than anybody I know to find inside an inner well of ideas and expressions that don't just straddle a stylistic point of view. It's something about content. It's something, and the content is the soul, the human soul. And this is where I too like to see the work moving to. However, not everything has a soul. So we're here at the Neue Sammlung at the Pinakothek der Moderne in Munich, where we will be opening the show this year. The working title for the show is called Vanity of Object, and not Vanity of the Photographer. The reason being that in every case, it's the object that was the point of the photograph. And as much as I might have interfered, it wasn't really supposed to be about making my picture. What is beautiful about being in a museum is the chance for our society to share its culture, and that is a kind of a pollination. I certainly am a product of being pollinated by the Art Institute in Chicago. I have really remember being fascinated and watching paintings, and now I see often those come out making the pictures. So having worked with people like Ingo Maurer, Ron Arad, Philippe Starck, Michele De Lucchi, and some others, I find that what's really important is this point of originality. This is what really is the seed, a new seed, but it's a seed that grows from insemination, from museums, from all of the influences of the culture, your mother, and in my case, even television, which I watch too much of. So when we look around and think about this idea of vanity of object, it isn't to be confused with narcissism. It's something about being aware of your beauty, thinking of beauty, trying to manifest or to make concrete an idea of beauty, and doing it in a way that defines you, the artist, the creator. Ron has his signature, Ingo has his way, and that's not to be confused with styling, because styling becomes a kind of a formula. It's better discovery, refinement, and developing those ideas to a point that you could say, okay, time to move on to the next.